The planet was dying. Its once lush green lands had turned to dust, and the once bustling cities now lay in ruins. Every day, the sun seemed to burn hotter, and the crops that once fed its people no longer grew. The air was thick with the dust of 1,000 years of neglect. Those who still remained on the planet were nothing more than survivors clinging to life in a world that had forgotten how to nurture them. Among the ruins of a shattered city, a woman named Alara walked slowly, her feet dragging against the cracked ground. Her clothes were torn, and her face was gaunt from days without food. Her eyes, once bright with hope, were now dull with exhaustion. But there was one thing that kept her moving forward: her child. Her daughter, Lyra, was only 5 years old. Despite the harsh conditions, her laughter still rang through the silence of their home. Even if it was only for a moment, Alara held her close as they moved through the desolate streets, her stomach growling with hunger. The world around them had changed, but the love between a mother and her child had not. For 3 days, they had not eaten. The last scraps of food had been eaten yesterday, and now they were out of options. Alara knew that they had to reach the last remaining food supply. If they were lucky, there would be something left, the last remnants of a world that had once been filled with abundance. The alien empire had arrived months ago. They had promised to save the planet, but all they had done was take. They claimed that they were here to help, but every action they took seemed to push the planet further into despair. The resources of the planet had been stripped away to fuel their war machines, and what little was left was being kept under heavy guard. As Alara approached the food supply depot, she saw the alien soldiers standing watch. Their imposing figures towered over her, their eyes hidden behind dark helmets. They had no pity for the starving people of the planet. To them, the humans were nothing more than a nuisance and obstacle to their conquest. Alara stopped in her tracks. The sight of the soldiers filled her with fear, but she couldn't stop now. Her daughter needed food. The thought of her little girl going hungry made Alara's heart ache with a pain she couldn't describe. She looked down at Lyra, who was clinging to her side, her small hands trembling. "Please," Alara whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. "Just a little food for her." With shaky hands, Alara stepped forward, her heart pounding. In her chest, she knew that she was nothing more than a beggar in the eyes of these aliens. But she had nothing left to lose. She had seen too many of her friends and family fall victim to hunger and despair. She refused to let her daughter be one of them. As she approached the soldiers, one of them raised a hand to stop her. His voice, though muffled by his helmet, was clear and cold. "You do not belong here. Move along." Alara's throat tightened, and she could feel the tears welling up in her eyes. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. She had begged before, but it had never worked. The aliens had no compassion for her kind. But today, there was something different. In the air, the desperation in Alara's heart burned like a fire, and she was no longer afraid. She took a step closer, her voice trembling as she spoke. "Please," she repeated. "My daughter hasn't eaten in days. We have nothing left. Please, just the scraps. Just enough to keep us alive for another day." The soldier's eyes narrowed behind his helmet. For a moment, Alara thought he might turn her away, as they had done so many times before. But then something changed in his expression. There was a flicker of something Alara couldn't quite place. It was almost as if he were unsure. His hand dropped from the weapon at his side, and for a brief moment, he seemed to hesitate. "One moment," he muttered, before turning to speak with his commander. Alara's heart raced. Could it be? Could she actually be heard? Her mind raced with possibilities. If she could just get close enough to the food, she could take whatever scraps they would give her and escape. Before they had time to stop her, she couldn't waste another second. Her daughter was depending on her. The commander, a tall and imposing figure, walked over to Alara, his footsteps heavy on the cracked ground. He stopped in front of her, his cold eyes scanning her thin, trembling form. He said nothing at first, simply staring at her with an expression that could have been pity or perhaps disdain. Then, in a voice that could have frozen the air itself, he spoke. "You want food. You will have it. But know this planet is ours. You are nothing. Here, you have no value. Remember that." Alara swallowed hard. the sting of his words cutting deep. But she held her ground, her gaze steady. "I don't care," she said quietly. "I care about my daughter. That's all." The commander's eyes flickered with something a hint of surprise, maybe. For the first time, he seemed to take a long look at her, his expression unreadable. He turned to his soldiers and gave them a silent command. Moments later, a small ration of food was placed before her. It was far less than she had hoped for, but it was something. Alara knelt down, her fingers trembling as she reached for the food. She could see her daughter's hopeful eyes watching her, waiting. For the first time in days, Alara felt something inside her stir a flicker of hope. But little did she know, the simple act of pleading for food would set off a chain of events that would change the fate of their world forever. Alara's hands shook as she carefully divided the food between herself and her daughter. The rations they had been given were meager, just a few small portions of what the aliens deemed enough for the day. It was barely enough to feed one person, let alone two, but Alara didn't complain. She had long since learned that complaining in the presence of these invaders was pointless. Survival, in this new world, meant learning how to take what you could get and make it last. Lyra, her young daughter, sat quietly beside her, her eyes wide with hunger but also with a flicker of hope. She had been silent for the past few days, too weak to complain, too tired to cry. Alara's heart ached at the sight of her little girl, who had once been so full of life, now so fragile and dependent. She had promised herself that she would do whatever it took to keep Lyra alive, no matter how small the morsels or how many days passed without a proper meal. They were camped in what used to be the heart of the city. The once towering skyscrapers were now skeletal remains, rusted and crumbling. The few remaining survivors lived in the shadows of what had been a symbol of human achievement, now reduced to ruins. The alien presence in the city had driven most people into hiding. Some had already been taken away, never to return. Others had given up, deciding that there was no point in fighting anymore. But Alara couldn't give up, not yet. She had been keeping track of the days, marking them with a small stone she had found in the dirt. Today marked the third day without food. Her stomach growled in protest, but she ignored it, focusing instead on Lyra's tired eyes. Lyra needed hope. She needed something to believe in, and Alara could not afford to show weakness. She took a deep breath, forcing a smile onto her face as she passed the small portion of food to her daughter. "Here, sweetheart," Alara said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's not much, but it's something. We'll be okay." Lyra's eyes sparkled, and for a brief moment, Alara saw a flicker of the child she once knew, the joy of having something to eat. No matter how little, lit up her face. She grabbed the food eagerly, as though it were the most precious thing in the world. Alara watched her with a mixture of relief and sadness. How long could they survive on scraps like this? She knew they needed more, much more. They needed to find a way to get food, to resist the alien invaders, to reclaim their planet. But how every attempt to gather resources had been met with harsh resistance from the aliens. They controlled everything now: the food, the water, even the air they breathed. The people of the city were nothing more than pawns in a game they couldn't even begin to understand. Alara sat back against a crumbling wall, exhausted. She had been thinking for days about how to survive this nightmare, how to survive under the oppression of the alien empire that had descended upon their world, stripping it bare, taking what they wanted, and leaving nothing behind but devastation. But in all her thinking, one thought kept returning to her: what if the aliens weren't just here for the resources? What if they had come for something more? As she mulled over this question, a voice broke through her thoughts. "We have to do something," came a quiet but firm voice from behind her. Alara turned to see Adon, a man she had known before the invasion. He was tall, strong, and once full of confidence. Now his face was hollow, his shoulders sagging under the weight of the world. But his eyes still held a fire, a defiance that Alara couldn't help but admire. "I know," Alara whispered back, not sure how to continue. The truth was, she didn't know what they could do. They were outnumbered, underfed, and living in constant fear of being caught by the aliens. What hope did they have of fighting back? Adon sat down next to her, his expression grim. I've been talking to some of the others, he said. We can't just wait for them to take everything. We need to fight back, Alara. We need to do something before they finish what they started. Alara looked at him, her heart heavy. The idea of fighting, of standing up to the aliens, seemed impossible. How could they possibly win against an enemy so powerful, so advanced, yet, deep inside her, a spark of something stirred, something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. What do you suggest? She asked quietly, already knowing that the answer would be dangerous, that the stakes would be higher than anything she had ever faced. Adon met her gaze, his eyes hardening with determination. We gather the others. We need to make a stand. Alara, we fight for our planet, for our people. We take back what's ours. Alara's heart raced as his words sank in. They had never been warriors. They were farmers, builders, teachers. But something about Adon's conviction made her wonder, could they really fight back? Could they really reclaim what had been stolen from them? The fear that had held her for so long began to fade, replaced by a fierce determination. If there was even the slightest chance that they could push the invaders back, if they could show their strength, then she had to try. She had to give her daughter more than just survival. She had to give her a chance at a real life, a future. We'll do it, Alara said, her voice stronger now. We'll fight. And as she spoke those words, something deep inside her awakened. It wasn't just the will to survive anymore, it was the will to resist, to fight for a future not just for her daughter, but for all the people who still had the strength to stand up and fight. This was just the beginning. The battle for their home had only just begun. The sun began to dip beneath the horizon, casting long shadows over the ruined city as Alara and Adon moved through the streets, quietly gathering the last remnants of hope that had been left in their wake. The world around them was silent, but it was a heavy kind of silence, the kind that whispered of defeat, of lives lost to hunger, to despair, to the alien invaders who had taken everything. But now, something had shifted. The air was charged with a quiet kind of energy, as though the planet itself was holding its breath, waiting for the spark of change. Alara could feel it deep in her bones. She could feel the stirring of something much bigger than herself, something larger than the fear that had held her back for so long. She had a purpose now. We can't wait for another moment, Adon said, his voice low but urgent as he led the way through the darkened streets. We need to act, Alara. The longer we wait, the more they take. She nodded, her mind racing with the possibilities. How could they possibly stand up to the alien empire? What could they, a small group of starving survivors, do against an enemy that had crushed entire civilizations with ease? It felt impossible, but she couldn't ignore the spark of hope that had taken root in her chest. The more she thought about it, the more she realized perhaps it wasn't about fighting the aliens directly. Perhaps it was about showing them that humanity wasn't going down without a fight, not just for survival, but for dignity, for the very right to exist. As they approached the hidden gathering place, a few familiar faces began to emerge from the shadows, their eyes filled with the same weary determination Alara had seen in Adon. These were the ones who had refused to give in, who had kept hope alive even when it seemed impossible. And now they had come together, united by the same purpose to resist. We're ready, Adon said, addressing the small group that had gathered around a fire pit, the flickering flames illuminating their tired faces. We're going to show them that they can't just take everything from us. We're going to fight back. Alara stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest. She felt the weight of the moment press down on her, but she didn't falter. She had come too far, and she wasn't about to turn back now. She looked into the eyes of the people around her. Some were older, their faces lined with years of hardship. Others were younger, their eyes full of the same fear and uncertainty that had once plagued Alara. But now, there was something different in their gaze. It was the fire of defiance, the spark of rebellion. I know it's not much, she began, her voice steady despite the tremor she felt inside. We have no weapons, no army, no real strength, but we have something the aliens will never have. We have each other. We have the will to survive, to fight for our homes, for our families, for the future. A murmur of agreement passed through the group. There was something contagious about Alara's words. something that lit up the room with an energy they hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't much, but it was enough to ignite the spark they needed. "We won't stand by and let them destroy what's left of our world," she continued. "We're going to fight, not just for ourselves, but for all the people who've been taken. For the ones who can't fight for themselves, we'll show them that humanity will not be erased." The fire crackled, the flames leaping higher as the group gathered around, their faces illuminated by the light of the fire. Alara could see the resolve in their eyes, the quiet determination that had been buried beneath the weight of fear. For the first time in days, she saw something else, something powerful. "Hope, we start small," Adon said, his voice cutting through the tension in the air. "We need to know where they're keeping the food stores, the supplies. We need to gather information, disrupt their operations, and create chaos. But we do it together, and we do it smart." Alara nodded, her mind already working through the plan. It wasn't much, but it was a start. They would have to be clever, use their knowledge of the city and the aliens' routines to their advantage. They couldn't afford to take risks, couldn't afford to make any mistakes. Every step had to be calculated, every move precise. "We'll go in, get what we can, and get out," Adon said. "And once we have enough, we'll bring the others in. We'll make them see that we're not just a dying planet. We're a force to be reckoned with." The weight of his words settled over Alara, but instead of fear, she felt a rush of determination. This was it, the moment they had all been waiting for, the moment they had all feared. But it was also the moment they would rise. "We need to get some rest," Alara said, breaking the silence that had fallen over the group. "Tomorrow, we begin." The group nodded, one by one, their eyes bright with resolve. They would fight. They would stand together against an enemy that thought they were nothing more than pawns in a game. But Alara knew better. Humanity had always been underestimated, and now it was time to prove the aliens wrong. As the group dispersed, heading to their makeshift shelters for what little rest they could find, Alara sat by the fire, staring into the flames. Her thoughts raced, but there was a sense of peace in her heart. They had a plan, and for the first time in a long time, Alara felt like she was part of something bigger, something powerful. The fire flickered, casting long shadows on the walls of the ruined city. But in those shadows, something was stirring. A rebellion was born that night, not just in the hearts of Alara and her small group, but in the hearts of all those who had watched from the sidelines, waiting for a sign, waiting for the moment to act. Tomorrow, they would fight, and tomorrow, they would show the aliens what humanity was truly capable of. The city was still asleep when Alara and Adon set out that morning. The only sound the distant hum of the alien ships overhead. The streets were eerily quiet, save for the faint rustle of wind against broken windows and scattered debris. It felt like the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to change. But what if today wasn't just another day of survival? What if today was the day they took a stand? Alara adjusted her ragged scarf around her neck, the fabric clinging to her skin as the cold morning air cut through the ruins of the once great city. They had to move quickly. They had a plan, but plans often fell apart the moment they were put into action. They couldn't afford to hesitate. Adon moved silently beside her, his eyes scanning every shadow, every corner. He had been a fighter once, back when humanity still had the strength to fight back. Now, he was more of a leader than a soldier, guiding the few remaining rebels like Alara through the debris-filled streets. There were only a handful of them, but that was all they needed. Stealth was their greatest ally. They had one goal today: infiltrate the alien food depot hidden deep within the heart of the city, gather what they could, and get out before anyone noticed. The aliens were ruthless, and any sign of rebellion was met with swift retribution. But today, they would take a risk. Today, they would show the invaders that they had not been broken, not yet. The path to the depot was treacherous, winding through narrow alleyways and collapsed buildings, the remnants of a once thriving human civilization now reduced to rubble. The depot itself was guarded heavily, its towering gates standing as a grim reminder of the aliens' control. But there was a weakness, a gap in their patrol patterns. If they were quick enough, they could slip through unnoticed. As Alara and Adon neared the edge of the depot's perimeter, they crouched behind a broken wall, taking shelter in the shadows. Alara's breath came in shallow gasps as she waited for the signal to move. Her heart was pounding in her chest, the weight of what they were about to do pressing down on her. There was no going back now. Adon looked at her, his expression determined but tinged with concern. "Are you ready?" he whispered. Alara nodded, her jaw set. She wasn't just doing this for herself, or for the resistance. She was doing this for Lyra, for all the people who had suffered in silence, too afraid to speak out. Today, they would make their voices heard. With a deep breath, they moved. Their steps were calculated, measured. Every movement was a dance between staying hidden and getting closer to their goal. Alara's mind raced as they made their way through the city. She had never felt more alive, more focused. The stakes had never been higher, and yet, there was something about this moment that gave her strength. The fear, the doubt, they had all faded away, replaced by a singular purpose. They reached the depot's outer wall, crouching low as they approached the gap in the security. Adon checked his watch, counting the seconds. The timing had to be perfect. Now, they slipped through the gap, moving quickly but silently, their bodies pressed against the cold, rough surface of the wall. Every step felt like a heartbeat, each one louder than the last. The sounds of the alien patrols echoed around them, their mechanical voices piercing the otherwise quiet air. Alara's pulse quickened as they neared the entrance. The depot was just ahead. They could see the guarded gates, the soldiers stationed at every corner. They would have to be careful. One wrong move, and it would all fall apart. Adon motioned for Alara to follow him as he led the way to a small side door that appeared to be slightly ajar. It was a risk, but it was the only way in. They reached the door and paused for a moment, listening for any sounds. The hum of machinery inside was deafening, but there were no signs of movement. Adon carefully pushed the door open, the squeak of the hinges barely audible in the quiet. Inside, the depot was a maze of narrow corridors and steel shelves, each one stacked high with crates of food. Alara's stomach tightened as she caught sight of the food, real, tangible food, something they hadn't seen in days. But there was no time to stop and admire it. They had come for a specific goal, and they had to stick to it. Adon motioned for Alara to follow as he navigated the dark hallway. They moved quickly, sticking to the shadows, avoiding the occasional patrolling guard. The tension in the air was palpable, the weight of the situation pressing down on them with every step they took. But Alara couldn't back down now. There was too much at stake. They reached a small storage area at the far end of the depot, and Adon quickly got to work. Alara stood watch, her eyes darting between the shelves and the hallway. Every second felt like an eternity as she waited for Adon to finish gathering the supplies. When he was done, he handed her a bag, its contents heavy with the food they had managed to steal. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep them going for a while longer. Adon gave her a nod, and they turned to leave. But as they made their way back toward the door, a sharp noise rang out in alarm, triggered by something they had missed. The depot was no longer quiet. The guards had been alerted. The chase had begun. Alara's heart raced as she and Adon ran, their footsteps echoing through the narrow hallways. They had to make it out. There was no other choice. They burst through the side door and into the open air, the sounds of alien voices growing louder behind them. They didn't look back. They couldn't afford to. Their only focus now was getting out of the city, getting to safety. The alien empire had underestimated them. They had thought that humanity was weak, that it had no fight left. But they were wrong. This was just the beginning. The resistance had begun, and Alara was ready to lead it, no matter what. The chase didn't stop at the depot. It followed them like a shadow, as relentless as the alien forces themselves. Alara's breath came in ragged gasps as she and Adon darted through the narrow alleyways, the weight of the stolen supplies slowing them down. Every corner they turned felt like another step into danger, but they couldn't afford to stop. Not now, not when they had a chance. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew louder. The alien soldiers were fast, efficient, trained to hunt down anyone who dared challenge their control. But Alara and Adon weren't just running from them. They were running toward something They were running toward hope. The wind whipped through the broken streets, kicking up dust and debris as they raced through the ruins. Their footsteps echoed in the silence, a stark reminder that the world around them had changed. The city that had once been alive with the hustle of everyday life was now nothing more than a shell of its former self, abandoned and forsaken. The aliens had come, stripped it of its resources, and left its people in the dust. But today they had stolen something back. As they rounded another corner, Alara felt a sharp sting in her side, her breath catching in her chest. She pressed on, ignoring the pain, the exhaustion. They couldn't stop. Not yet. They had to get back to the safe house, to the others who were waiting for them. They had to share what they had found. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Adon's voice cut through her thoughts. "We're almost there. Keep going." She nodded, pushing herself harder. She could feel the adrenaline coursing through her veins, each step bringing them closer to safety. But she knew that the danger wasn't over yet. They were close, but they weren't out of the woods, not by a long shot. The alleyway ahead of them opened up into a small square, a place that had once been a bustling market, full of vendors selling food and trinkets. Now, it was deserted, its stalls overturned, its signs faded and broken, the perfect place to disappear. Alara and Adon reached the edge of the square and stopped, their backs pressed against the crumbling walls. They didn't dare to breathe, not yet. The sound of the alien soldiers' boots grew louder, closer. They were just behind them, almost on top of them. Alara's heart pounded in her chest as she watched the shadows stretch across the square. Suddenly, there was a movement in the distance, a flicker of light, a figure. Alara's eyes widened as she recognized the familiar silhouette. It was one of the others, one of the resistance fighters who had been waiting for them. She hadn't expected them to be so close, but it was exactly what they needed. Adon turned to her, his eyes narrowing. "We can make it. Just a little longer." Alara nodded, her muscles screaming in protest, but she didn't stop. Together, they moved quickly toward the figure, slipping into the shadows, careful to keep out of sight of the advancing soldiers. The figure was waiting by a broken-down vehicle, its engine humming softly, ready to move. They had made it. "Alara, Adon, get in." The figure called, a whisper carried by the wind. Without hesitation, they jumped into the vehicle, which immediately started moving, speeding away from the square and into the maze of streets beyond. The sounds of pursuit began to fade, but Alara knew better than to believe they were safe. The aliens would be relentless. They always were. The vehicle sped through the ruined city, bouncing over potholes and uneven ground as they made their way to the Resistance's hidden base. Alara's heart was still racing, her mind a blur of thoughts. But there was a sense of relief, a fleeting moment of peace. They had done it. They had stolen food from the enemy's grasp, a small victory in a war that seemed never-ending. As the vehicle turned a corner, Alara looked back at the city, its skyline silhouetted against the setting sun. It was hard to believe that this had once been a place of life, a city that had known joy and laughter. Now it was a ghost town, haunted by the memories of a lost world. But they hadn't given up, and neither would the others. They couldn't afford to. The vehicle continued its journey, the low hum of its engine filling the silence between them. Alara sat back, her body aching, but her heart lighter than it had been in days. They were getting closer. The base was just ahead. "We'll rest there," Adon said, his voice calm but laced with determination. "Then we'll make a plan." Alara nodded, grateful for the quiet moment, but knowing that the real battle had only just begun. The alien empire wasn't going to let them off so easily. They would retaliate. They would come for them, but they were ready now. They had taken the first step, and it had been enough to show the invaders that humanity was not going down without a fight. As they approached the hidden base, Alara could see the others waiting for them. There were more of them now, more people who had joined the resistance, drawn in by the small victories, by the hope that perhaps, just perhaps, they could win this war. The vehicle came to a stop, and the group disembarked quickly, moving toward the entrance of the base. Inside, the atmosphere was different than it had been before. There was a quiet buzz of energy, a feeling of purpose that hadn't been there in days. They were ready. They had food. They had a plan, and most importantly, they had hope. Alara and Adon entered the room, where the rest of the resistance gathered. The moment they walked in, all eyes turned to them, expectant. Alara took a deep breath and smiled, holding up the bag of supplies they had fought so hard to retrieve. It wasn't much, but it was a start. "We're not done yet," she said, her voice steady and full of conviction. "But today we took something back. We stole from the invaders, and that's only the beginning." The room erupted into applause, the faces of the rebels lighting up with a fire that hadn't been there just hours before. They had hope again. They had something to fight for. Alara looked around at them, her heart swelling with pride. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. And for the first time in a long while, she believed that they could win this war. They would fight together, and they would take back their world. The morning light filtered through the cracked windows of the safe house, casting long shadows across the worn floors. The hum of the city outside was barely audible, drowned out by the quiet buzz of activity inside. Alara sat at a rickety table, a map spread out before her, her fingers tracing the pathways through the city. The plan had to be perfect. They couldn't afford to make a single mistake. The stolen food was carefully stored in the corner, a small but vital victory that had given them just enough to continue. It wasn't much, but it was a symbol of something greater, a spark of rebellion in the darkness. And now they had to figure out how to turn that spark into a flame. Adon stood by the door, his back to the wall, his arms crossed as he watched. Alara, he could see the weight of the responsibility in her eyes, the pressure that came with leadership, but there was something else to a fire. She had transformed since the night they had stolen from the depot. She was no longer just surviving. She was planning. She was leading. "We can't keep playing defense," Adon said, breaking the silence. His voice was steady, but there was an underlying urgency there. "We need to hit them where it hurts. We need to go on the offensive." Alara looked up at him, her brow furrowed as she processed his words. The idea of attacking the aliens directly was daunting. They were still vastly outnumbered, under-equipped, and outclassed in almost every way. But she knew he was right. Survival wasn't enough anymore. They had to reclaim their world. "We start small," she said, her voice firm as she looked back down at the map. "We've already stolen from them once. Now we need to hit their supply lines. We disrupt their operations. Every day they have to waste resources on securing their shipments. The weaker they become." Adon nodded. "We'll hit their convoys. We'll make them scared to move anything through the city. If we can slow down their supply chain, we weaken them, but we have to be fast. We can't afford to get bogged down." Alara's hand hovered over a key point on the map, a stretch of road that cut through the industrial district. It was a well-guarded route, frequently used by the aliens to transport supplies from their central depot to their command center. The convoy was a lifeline for the invaders, and if they could strike it, it would send a message, a signal that humanity wasn't as weak as they thought. "This is it," Alara said, tapping the map. "We target this convoy. We ambush them here, just outside the city. We can use the terrain to our advantage." Adon leaned in, studying the map with her. "It's risky, but it could work. We'll need to move quickly, and we'll need everyone in position." Alara turned to the others, who had gathered around the table. They were a mix of young and old, all hardened by the months of resistance. Each face in the room reflected the same resolve that had driven her since that first night of desperation. They were ready. "We'll divide into two groups," Alara continued. "A small team will be stationed here, at the intersection. We'll wait for the convoy, then cut them off when they pass. The rest of you will secure the supply crates once we've taken them down." The room fell silent as everyone absorbed the plan. It was simple, but effective. They were going to attack the convoy, disrupt the supply line, and take what they could before disappearing back into the shadows. It was dangerous, but it was their best chance. Adon's voice broke through the quiet. "We'll need to be smart. The aliens won't let this go unnoticed. We'll have to be out and in before they can call for backup." Alara nodded. "We move like shadows. No one gets left behind." The group spent the next few hours preparing, gathering what little equipment they had, and moving out under the cover of the fading light. Alara's heart raced as she tightened the straps on her boots and checked her rifle. It was a familiar feeling, the weight of the mission, the uncertainty of what lay ahead, but it was also something more. It was the feeling of taking control, of stepping out from the shadows and into the light. They met at the edge of the city, where the cracked pavement gave way to overgrown grass and broken roads. The convoy would pass through here in a few hours, and they had to be ready. The team split into their positions, each member disappearing into the terrain, their movements swift and silent. Alara crouched low behind a dilapidated wall, her eyes trained on the horizon. Her pulse quickened as she checked her weapon. One last time. The hours stretched on, the minutes ticking by like the steady beat of a drum. They were so close now, she could feel it. The world around her seemed to hold its breath. As the sound of distant engines rumbled through the air, it was them. Adon's voice crackled through the comms. "They're coming. Get ready." Alara's grip tightened around her rifle. This was it. No turning back now. The convoy appeared on the road ahead, their armored vehicles moving in a tight formation. Alara's heart pounded as she signaled the team to move into position. Everything had to go perfectly. One mistake, and they were done. As the convoy neared the intersection, Alara gave the signal. The team sprang into action. The sound of gunfire echoed through the air as they ambushed the convoy, their shots precise and calculated. The aliens were caught off guard, their soldiers scrambling for cover. As the resistance fighters closed in on them, the battle was chaotic, but they had the element of surprise. Alara's mind raced as she moved through the firefight, her eyes scanning for any signs of danger. They had to secure the supply crates quickly. She spotted Adon, directing the others as they loaded the crates into a nearby truck. They were winning. For the first time in a long time, they were winning. The alien soldiers fought back fiercely, but they were disorganized, their confusion evident in their frantic movements. Alara could see their commander in the distance, shouting orders, but it was too late. The resistance had already taken control. As the last of the crates were loaded onto the truck, Alara felt a surge of triumph. They had done it. They had struck a blow against the invaders. The convoy was defeated, and the supplies they had taken would sustain them for weeks. It was a small victory, but it was theirs. But as Alara watched the team begin to retreat, a sense of unease settled over her. They had won this battle, but the war was far from over. The aliens would retaliate, and they would come for them with everything they had. But Alara wasn't afraid. Not anymore. This was just the beginning. They had shown the invaders what humanity was capable of, and they would keep showing them until the world was theirs again. The night felt heavier than usual as Alara stood on the rooftop of the safe house, watching the horizon where the last of the day's light had just faded. The city, once full of life, now seemed like an abandoned graveyard. Broken buildings, lifeless streets, and the occasional flicker of alien patrol lights in the distance. It was a world that had been reshaped by invaders, but it was still their home. Alara's fingers brushed against the rough edge of the rooftop, her gaze distant. The victory over the alien convoy had been significant, but she couldn't afford to get comfortable. It was only one battle in a war that was far from over, and the aliens, ruthless as they were, would retaliate. They had to. She could already feel the weight of what was to come. Behind her, the sounds of the others preparing for the next phase of their resistance echoed through the safe house. They had taken the first step, striking at the heart of the enemy's supply chain, but now they needed to do more. The food they had stolen was enough to sustain them for a while, but the real battle would be fought on the ground. They couldn't keep running forever. Eventually, they'd have to face the aliens head-on. A soft voice broke her thoughts. "Alara." It was Adon, his figure silhouetted against the dim light of the doorway. He had been with her through it, all through the fear, the uncertainty, and now the growing hope. But she could see it in his eyes, to the weight of leadership, the responsibility of guiding them all. She turned to face him, trying to shake off the tension that had settled deep in her chest. "I'm fine, just thinking." He stepped closer, his voice low. "I know, but it's time to think about the next move. We can't keep hiding forever. The aliens will come for us eventually. The question is, are we ready?" Alara looked out over the broken city once more, the remnants of her home. A question lingered in the back of her mind. one that she had been wrestling with since the first shot was fired. What was the real cost of this rebellion? How far could they push before they couldn't push anymore? But the answer, she realized, wasn't something that could be thought through. It had to be lived. They couldn't afford to hesitate. "We'll be ready," she said finally, her voice steady. "The aliens think we're weak, that we're just survivors. But they're wrong. We'll show them what happens when they mess with humanity." Adon's eyes softened, and he gave a small nod. "You're right, but we can't do it alone. We need everyone in this fight, everyone who's still out there, the other cities, the ones that haven't fallen. We need to unite them, or this will just be a series of small victories with no real impact." Alara knew what he was saying. They had been operating under the radar, keeping to the shadows, striking quickly, and disappearing before the aliens could respond. But that wasn't enough anymore. They needed more than just guerrilla tactics. They needed an army. A movement, a united front to show the aliens that humanity was a force they could no longer ignore. "We'll do it," Alara said firmly. "We'll send out the word. The other resistance groups need to know we're fighting back. They need to see that we're winning, that there's hope." Adon looked relieved but still uneasy. "It's risky, but I trust you." Alara took a deep breath, a sense of resolve settling over her. She could feel the pulse of her heart, quick and steady. As she realized that they had reached the tipping point, they could no longer wait, no longer play it safe. If they wanted to reclaim their planet, they had to take the fight to the aliens. Not just survive, but push them back. The hours that followed were a blur of activity. The resistance gathered in the basement, where their makeshift command center was located. The walls were lined with maps, intelligence reports, and a patchwork of communication equipment. The air was thick with anticipation. But there was something else to something Alara had seen growing in the eyes of the others since the convoy attack. It wasn't just fear or desperation anymore. It was determination, hope. "We send out messages to all the other groups," Alara said, standing in front of the gathered fighters. "We tell them we're not just surviving anymore. We're fighting back. We'll unite the resistance, spread out across the remaining cities. We take the fight to the aliens, and we do it together." A murmur of agreement spread through the room. Alara could see the spark of something new in their eyes. They had tasted victory, and it was sweet. They had proven that the aliens could be challenged, that they were not invincible. Adon stepped forward, his voice firm. "We have one chance at this. The aliens won't sit idly by while we rally the rest of humanity. Once the message goes out, we have to be ready for everything." Alara nodded, her mind already turning over the next steps. She knew this would be their greatest challenge yet. The aliens were not just an army. They were an empire. But Alara refused to believe that they were unbeatable. If humanity could unite, if they could fight with the same fire that had burned in their ancestors during their darkest days, they could push back the invaders. Later that night, as Alara stood at the edge of the safe house watching the stars twinkle in the vast, dark sky, she felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. Hope. It was fragile, like a single flame flickering in the dark, but it was real. They were not alone anymore. They were a united front, and together they could fight back. In the distance, the faint hum of alien ships could be heard, their searchlights scanning the city below. But Alara didn't flinch. She knew what was coming, and she was ready. The resistance had begun, and this was just the beginning. The world would not fall without a fight, and they would be the ones to deliver that fight. No longer would they cower in the shadows. No longer would they wait for the invaders to dictate their future. This was humanity's stand. The fight for their planet was only just beginning, and Alara knew, deep in her bones, that they would not lose.